boa tarde também a quem se encontra em outras localidades. É com muita alegria que eu dou início aqui ao nosso segundo painel do nosso segundo dia desse grandioso congresso realizado pelo Instituto Brasileiro de Direito Tributário, em parceria com a Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de São Paulo. Eu sou o Bruno Feierstein, eu serei o presidente deste painel, agradeço a organização do evento pela oportunidade, fico muito satisfeito com essa oportunidade que me foi dada e vamos aqui nesse segundo painel falar sobre um tema absolutamente atual, absolutamente relevante, no contexto, obviamente, do direito tributário internacional. Falaremos dos desafios e lições durante o enfrentamento da Covid. Como eu disse, é um tema absolutamente atual e que está trazendo lições para toda a sociedade em todos os aspectos e também, obviamente, para a nossa tributação internacional, objeto do Congresso. Vou apresentar aos senhores aqui os nossos painelistas, seguindo o padrão do Congresso, teremos painelistas de diversas universidades e diversas partes do mundo. É uma alegria que traz a grandiosidade do nosso evento. Teremos dos Estados Unidos a professora Diane Ring, professora do Boston College Law School, Estados Unidos. Teremos o professor Fernando Zilvetti, brasileiro, nosso professor e diretor do IBDT do Brasil. Teremos também a professora Ágata Uceda, da Espanha, professora da Universidade de Leiden, da Holanda. Então, temos aqui uma espanhola representando a Universidade Holandesa. Temos também conosco Fabiola Anacondia, argentina, membro especializado em VAT do IBFD, da Holanda, que também mais uma representação multinacional, e temos como nosso moderador o professor Ramon Tomazella Santos, brasileiro, mestre e doutorando pela USP em São Paulo, do Brasil. Então, muito obrigado pela presença de todos vocês. Eu vou coordenar os debates aqui, cada um, como sabemos, tem 15 minutos. Começando as nossas explanações pela professora Diane Ring, que vai falar um pouquinho sobre legislação em tempos de pandemia, legislando em tempos de pandemia e alguns outros aspectos. Professora Diane, por favor, a palavra é sua, 15 minutos, novamente agradecendo pela sua apresentação.
Great. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning and to start off our panel that is looking at international tax in the context of pandemic. And I just would like to note that my remarks this morning are based in part on my work with my colleagues at Boston College Law School. So I'd like to thank them for their role in this. The topic that we're talking about this morning is one that really acknowledges the ways in which tax and tax regulation never stands alone. And as you heard in the first panel this morning from Monica Victor, right, this is sort of a widely recognized and constant challenge for those of us engaging in tax regulation. But now it looks different. And we would argue that at this point, we're facing a truly unprecedented situation. Countries are uniformly, I'm just going to make a quick move here on my screen. Countries are uniformly facing a kind of challenge that they've not seen before. And we would argue that countries around the globe are trying to meet at the same time three distinct policy goals, policy priorities that turn out to be challenging. And so here we have the three on the screen, trying to deliver social insurance, provide a social safety net to individuals in the country, address systemic risk in the economy, and then finally deal with what we describe as sort of spatio-behavioral issues. And what I want to do is just take a moment and say a little bit more about each of these, and then shift into the question of how are we seeing these three major policy priorities shape some of the changes in business taxation. Right? So first, in terms of social insurance and safety nets, jurisdictions have these in place in varying ways before the pandemic, whether that's unemployment insurance, disability insurance, even consumer bankruptcy, or provisions that allow your tax debt to be forgiven can really fit into this, this category. And there are many different techniques and mechanisms that jurisdictions can use to deliver this kind of social insurance or safety net. It can be direct or indirect, right? You can give food or provide a tax expenditure that sort of puts more cash in the hands of a taxpayer that they can go buy something with. You can link benefits to work, to being an employee or not. And you can try to help businesses, help employers on the theory that if they do well, their employees will do well and won't need a social safety net, or you might deliver some benefits directly to workers. And the choices that jurisdictions make here, and the choices they're making in the pandemic on how to address social insurance and the social safety net, are going to impact their success and their options, both in dealing with the systemic economic concerns as well as the sort of spatial behavioral issues. So thinking about that second prong, what are we worried about when we're thinking about systemic economic and financial risk, right, in the pandemic moment? This looks really different from 2008. And that was a financial crisis that hit some countries, but not others really. And at the time, the focus was on systemic risk, where that phrase was, at least sort of in the US context, understood to refer to concerns about financial contagion, financial institutions, banks, right? Today, what are countries worried about? Financial and non-financial systems. We're sort of risks across both, risks that financial concerns will then hit into the non-financial sector, and that business failures will impact the financial and banking sector. We're even worried, obviously, about contagions within the business economy. So if I run a business and I can't get my inputs, my global supply chain is broken, then I can't make what I sell, I don't have gross revenue, I lay off my workers, right? I don't pay my rent, I may default on my corporate debt, I may finally go into bankruptcy. Right? And along the way, all the businesses with whom I connect are suffering now as well. How countries decide to respond and intervene in this kind of economic crisis is then going to impact, again, back to that sort of triangle, what is needed and what can be done with social insurance, and what happens on the sort of pandemic behavioral side. So that brings us to the last of the three sort of priorities countries are struggling with, and this one we've described as spatio-behavioral. Essentially, this is countries' efforts to have their populations engage in the kinds of behaviors that they believe will reduce spread of the virus. Whether we think of it as social distancing, mask wearing, regular kinds of testing, quarantining under a variety of circumstances, all of those are behaviors that are encouraged or advised or required under different circumstances to deal with the sort of pandemic part of the pandemic. But again, what we do there, right, is going to impact how successful we are with dealing with economic risk and dealing with the need for a social safety net. Okay. All right, and as I mentioned, we want to achieve all of these, but their intention. And I'll just give two quick ideas of sort of, why obviously meeting all three goals is challenging and they can be difficult, right? Some of the strategies that we might do to stimulate a weak economy, one that looks like it's heading towards recession, we might try to stimulate the consumer sector, get people out there buying, doing, engaging in the economy. But that's actually the opposite of what countries have been trying to do, at least in many cases, in a pandemic. We're not looking to have lots of travel. We're not looking for conferences and big events. We're not looking for big entertainment. Many places have closed restaurants or greatly restrained, right, their ability to service customers. And so the kinds of behaviors that help an economy, right, are not so helpful in the pandemic. Conversely, if an individual is struggling, and is finding perhaps him or herself out of work and needing a social safety net, that can be provided, but it often may come with requirements for or steps that the person must take to show they're actively seeking employment on a regular, continuous basis. Maybe that's not what you want people doing at the height of a pandemic. Right? As I said at the outset, all countries are really trying to meet these three priorities, but they may rate them differently. In addition, even within one country, the perspective of what's most important may shift over time. And I'm sure you can all think about that in the context of your own country from, say, March to the present. And on this slide, I've just identified some of the factors that may lead us to sort of shift our priorities among the three over time. So against that backdrop of sort of the big pandemic sort of regulatory frame that is driving countries, right? Even if they don't draw the triangle, is really what's driving their major concerns. Against that frame, what do we see happening in taxation? Right? How does this shape what's going on in the tax world, in particular business taxation? And what I'm going to do for the remainder of my time is just sort of outline 5 major areas in which I see these pandemic issues flowing into tax, into business tax in particular. But I'll do so at a relatively high level. And then the panelists who will follow me are going to be talking in more detail in more targeted areas, really to show you how these pandemic issues are revealing themselves in some of the tax policies, tax rules, tax issues that are arising in discrete areas. Okay, so here are the 5, but I think what makes the most sense is just to dive into them. So I'll go to my next slide. First big question, right? To what extent do we want to use business taxation to deliver social safety net benefits? And here I offer an example from the US. Right? In April, we decided that we needed to have paid leave for workers who were either sick or quarantining for COVID-19 or had to deal with family members doing the same thing and needed to take time off from work. Why did we do this? We wanted to encourage these people to not go to work. Right? We wanted them to stay home if they had any of those issues. Right? That's the prong about the spatial behavioral. But obviously there's a tension because we otherwise don't have any expectation of getting paid. Right? So the new provision Congress passed required many employers to provide this paid leave for a limited period of time to certain kinds of workers. Right? So that's cash to the workers. Right? So they're not working, they're staying at home for a pandemic-related reason here, but they're getting paid. The goal, though, was not to have the business bear the burden of this, but rather for the business to be the conduit for the cash. And so Congress also added a tax credit. Businesses who were paying this leave to their workers who were not there would get a credit from the government matching the leave being the pay being given to these workers. So in a sense, the business just was the flow through of the cash coming from the federal government to the workers. And it's, again, we're deciding to use the business taxation to deliver the social safety net, but in a way, in a manner that furthered our goals on containing a pandemic, encouraging good behavior in a pandemic. Okay? What about using business taxation to prevent the need for a social safety net? That was the second move that we saw happen in the US, again in April. In this context, we were looking at businesses facing a different situation. Here we had businesses who either were shut down or had virtually little or no revenue coming in. In that case, what's the business going to think about doing? Laying off workers. But we have evidence that suggests when workers are separated, when employees are separated from their business, from the firm, even when business improves again, it actually becomes difficult for them to kind of get connected back to that business. That disjuncture has a long-lasting effect. And so Congress had the goal of encouraging employers to keep their employees on the payroll, even if there was little or no business. The technique was the new employee retention tax credit. So employers who paid their workers, even though the the employers had little or no business because of the pandemic, could get a partial tax credit for the wages they were paying their workers. So it's not full, but again, meant to relieve it. Third, the next theme we see from the pandemic coming into business taxation is the ways in which the tax system intersects with efforts to just deliver cash to businesses to keep them afloat. Right? Now, there are ways in which we can tweak tax rules to give more cash up front, et cetera, to businesses. And the panelists following me will talk a little bit more about that. What I wanted to talk about here is when a government is actually giving so much cash, right? It's not going to be a matter of tweaking the tax system to get a little more cash in a business's hands, but rather the government is going to give a fair size chunk of cash to the business. So in this context, and again, using a little bit of a US example, we introduced a program of government-supported loans to businesses. These were smaller businesses. And the key exciting part was if the business used the money for certain payments, workers, rent, things like that, then the loans converted to grants and the businesses did not have to pay it back. Okay? So far, the tax system isn't really part of that. But the big question then emerged, well, when the loan converts to a grant and the debt is canceled, does the business suddenly have taxable income in the amount of the grant? And so we contemplated that for a bit and concluded no, right? When those loans convert to grants, if and when that happens, it doesn't generate taxable income in the system. But, right, the tax authorities issued a ruling that said the money that you get, that's that grant, you don't have to pay back. When you use that money to pay workers for their wages, to pay rent, you don't get a deduction on the tax return. This is very contentious right now in the US. Just this morning shows up again in our tax news, and there's a lot of expectation that come November, that might be changed depending on the election. Okay. Fourth, and I'm just going to say only a word about this, there are issues that always plague the tax system, and not just the tax system. Lobbying, issues about drafting, and then unintended results that often flow from drafting quickly. My point here is that the pandemic has put some special pressure on these problems. And again, the first panel actually talked a little bit about drafting issues generally, but the pandemic, first of all, some were lobbying more effectively than others. It was, not everyone was sort of on the same footing. Drafting challenges, Congress and then Treasury, IRS, had to quickly come up with regimes and then rules applying them that were going to make sure the benefits went where they were intended, only to those intended and the amounts intended, right? Difficult. And no surprise, you get unintended results. The last and final point I wanted to raise here was what I've described here, chronic underfunding of tax agencies. In the US, and the US is particularly at the forefront of this and not in a good way, but I don't think it's alone. Over the past more than a decade, we've seen intentional underfunding of the IRS, right? Clear intentional underfunding of the tax agency for generally political reasons. It's been a debate for almost 2 decades. But what we're seeing in the pandemic is the price you pay for that. As we came into April and looked at those 3 prongs, those 3 policy priorities, and thought about the action we wanted to take to further each of them, it turned out that the IRS played a central role in the design and delivery of various kinds of benefits. And there are various reasons why that made sense, right? It's a sort of it's uniquely positioned to know a lot about a lot of people, has an ability to sort of deliver benefits in multiple ways. But then we came up against the fact that we've been underfunding it for years, which means what? Very few employees, right? Laying off or not hiring, not replacing, not addressing infrastructure, computerization, updating system. And so when we put a large new task on the IRS, right, the question is, how is it going to do that while maintaining its regular job? And we need its regular job because we need the tax revenues. So as we look ahead, right? And we go through the rest of the panel, we're going to see that the pandemic is providing significant opportunities and sometimes incentives for substantive tax reform. I think one of the interesting questions is whether it's also going to provide an impetus for essentially reform to the infrastructure, right? A willingness to sort of fund and improve the infrastructure of the IRS, and whether or not there are ways in which, say, moves on the substantive tax reform front, right, will in fact energize us to think more about the infrastructure, or whether that will stand alone. But I now look forward to the next panelist, and so I'll turn it over to you.
Muito obrigado, professora Daiane. Considerações muito importantes aí sobre a importância das mudanças de legislação no atendimento aí à crise decorrente da pandemia. As mudanças foram implementadas com rapidez, né, pelos estados. A gente vê bastante sensibilidade de todos os órgãos legislativos para a emissão dessas regras. Muito interessante, então, suas considerações, agradecendo mais uma vez a sua participação. Eu passo a palavra ao professor Fernando Zilvetti, segunda fala do nosso painel. Ele vai falar sobre temas de política fiscal. Fernando, a palavra é sua.
Muito bom dia a todos, é um prazer estar aqui nesse congresso. Vamos direto à minha fala, que eu pensei até na sequência da minha colega Diana Ring, falar realmente de política fiscal em 5 tópicos especiais que eu preparei, falando primeiro da pandemia mesmo e as medidas fiscais, e na sequência trabalhar com o que se diz respeito ao postergamento de tributos, para seguir na sequência a questão do imposto de renda e as medidas fiscais. Em seguida, falar também dos tributos indiretos, tributos sobre consumo e as medidas fiscais também. E, por último, analisar um pouco o que seriam os impactos ao sistema tributário que isso poderia trazer. Então, iniciando a discussão, claro, a gente está falando de um efeito pandêmico, um efeito absolutamente devastador, né, do ponto de vista social e econômico, mas a gente teve outras crises mundiais, outras crises pandêmicas e outras crises não pandêmicas, em que se observou, durante a crise mesmo, durante a Grande Depressão econômica e social, a busca de hegemonias, né? Mesmo trabalhando num ambiente absolutamente devastador, ainda permaneciam e permanecem, nesse nosso caso, a questão hegemônica. A questão hegemônica, ela tem logo um efeito nas medidas fiscais que são tomadas no ambiente, vamos dizer, da jurisdição em si, mas também, isso é uma questão bastante recente no cenário mundial, são medidas globais, né? Globais, às vezes regionais, e também, às vezes, de blocos econômicos. Então, essa busca hegemônica, né? Hegemonia de cunho social e econômico, mas também buscando uma organização de medidas num ambiente mais orquestrado, vamos dizer assim, existe uma opção, né? Uma opção que você tem ou seguir organismos internacionais, como o OCDE, ou seguir a própria política interna. Então, os que são adeptos, países mais adeptos, mais afetos à Organização Mundial, e aqueles países que estão se posicionando absolutamente no campo ou de tratados internacionais ou até mesmo de enfrentar esta crise de maneira individual. Também há um outro trade-off que é preciso ser discutido na questão tributária, que diz respeito justamente à questão do trade-off entre tributos e dinheiro, né? Então, o gestor de política fiscal faz essa opção. Ele pode dar dinheiro ou ele pode dar tributos. Quando ele pensa assim, aí também a gente tem que olhar um pouco o que aconteceu na Europa, em outros países. Você pode derramar dinheiro no mercado, como o Banco Central Europeu fez, ou seja, ele coloca muito dinheiro no mercado e dá para os países membros da União Europeia uma ferramenta fiscal muito forte que ele pode abrir mão de arrecadação no momento, claro, que a gente está falando de distanciamento social, e esse distanciamento social fecha empresas, reduz muito a atividade empresarial, cria problemas logísticos, como a gente está enfrentando no agronegócio no Brasil, e, claro, do ponto de vista do contribuinte, tanto empresa quanto pessoa física, há uma perda de capacidade contributiva. Então, você tem que enfrentar esta questão. E aí vem a ideia de ferramentas fiscais e seus efeitos econômicos. O que a gente tem em relação a isso, né? Então, as ferramentas fiscais são importantes porque, de acordo com como você atua com essas ferramentas fiscais, pode haver um maior ou um menor efeito sistêmico. Quando a gente fala efeito sistêmico, ele é de distorção, ele distorce o sistema tributário, ele esgarça o sistema tributário, de modo a levar a algumas consequências que podem ser perenes ou podem ser circunstanciais. Então, o que o fisco faz é de responsabilidade natural do Estado. Ele atua também como responsável, ou ele assume responsabilidade sobre a catástrofe pandêmica, e daí ele pode tomar medidas de reparação do contribuinte ou medidas de indução, as chamadas medidas anticíclicas. E o jurista, como agente neste vamos dizer, circuito que nós estamos vivenciando, ele tem que observar isso e trabalhar de uma maneira a neutralizar os efeitos sistêmicos negativos. E aí, como fazer isso, né? Então, vamos pensar agora no segundo ponto da minha fala, que seria adiar os tributos, né? Então, já pensando na atuação do Estado, o Estado vai e adia o pagamento dos tributos e, em algumas circunstâncias, ele pode adiar tributos que são considerados tributos sobre o salário, que são os wage tax, como acontece com o Brasil, né? Então, ele pode trabalhar com os tributos sobre o sistema social, né? Então, os tributos sobre a folha. Ele pode, como aconteceu no Brasil, adiar o pagamento do FGTS, né, que não exatamente é um tributo sobre a folha, mas é uma contribuição, um fundo de amparo ao trabalhador. E ele pode também, como fez, adiar o pagamento do Simples, o Simples Nacional, que é um sistema simplificado de tributos brasileiro, parecido com outros sistemas mundo afora, mas essencialmente o que ele traz esta questão de consequência, que a gente vai analisar mais adiante. A Espanha, por sua vez, também trabalhou com a postergação de tributos federais e também tributos, vamos dizer, de consumo. Quando a gente fala federais, é lógico que a gente está falando de um sistema unificado como a Espanha, mas tem a sua particularidade. Claro que a Agatha vai trazer sua experiência sobre isso. Mas o que a gente está falando é sobre VAT, sobre imposto sobre consumo e também sobre imposto de renda e imposto corporativo. Tá? A França, por sua vez, ela trabalhou tanto com os impostos diretos, né, imposto de renda e outros impostos diretos, também sobre patrimônio, e os tributos sobre salários, a tributação, vamos dizer, social. Então, nesse ambiente de adiar impostos, você tem aí um efeito sobre aqueles que usariam os tributos como insumo ou usariam os tributos para diminuir sua base tributária e que naturalmente não tem essa base tributária reduzida, vão ter lá na frente com os efeitos sobre o seu próprio tributo, que a gente vai trabalhar um pouquinho mais adiante também nesse painel. Certo? A questão de adiar tributos está em quase todos os sistemas, eu só citei alguns, mas ele é um tipo de ajuda que é reparadora, né? Ela é de intervenção, ela traz para o contribuinte uma ajuda circunstancial de fluxo de caixa. Então, este fluxo de caixa, tanto nas pessoas físicas, quando a gente está falando de ambulantes, como pessoas de pequenos comerciantes que estão na pessoa física, fiscal também, na pessoa física, e também como o próprio produtor rural, que tem a sua postergação de tributos, o efeito é caixa, o efeito é fluxo de caixa, e que naturalmente dá a condição dele se recompor. Então, essa condição de recomposição patrimonial ou recomposição da capacidade de geração de riqueza. E isso a gente vai falar um pouquinho também mais adiante. Mas, seguindo a nossa exposição, nós teríamos que falar um pouco do imposto de renda. E agora o imposto de renda vem aí a discussão de você tem algumas ferramentas que você usa e que a gente pode comparar com os países que adotaram essas medidas no imposto de renda. Então, tanto a Alemanha quanto os Estados Unidos, sem contar outros países que eu não deixo de mencionar aqui, ou deixo de mencionar aqui, estenderam o limite de prejuízo fiscal. Tá? Então, o carry forward, né? Eles jogaram para os anos posteriores, dando a possibilidade do contribuinte usar o prejuízo pandêmico, que a gente chama, nos anos seguintes, ou seja, carregar este prejuízo para os anos subsequentes, aumentando o limite de dedutibilidade. Certo? Então, isso é importante, né, que a gente traga esta informação, porque tem um efeito também de reconstituição patrimonial, reconstituição da capacidade geradora de riqueza, que tem muito a ver com capacidade contributiva e também com renda líquida. Como a Daiane já comentou, é importante a gente frisar, a gente aumenta o limite de dedutibilidade. Talvez vários países dos Estados Unidos é um exemplo deles, eles aumentaram o limite de dedutibilidade para que você possa usar como dedutibilidade outros elementos que também não eram antigamente permitidos para usar como dedutibilidade. Então, isso também aconteceu na Europa, em alguns países, a França abordou isso, e a ideia de você aumentar a dedutibilidade funciona também como um efeito redutor de imposto de renda. A Bélgica, por sua vez, ela já decidiu reduzir o imposto de renda, reduziu a alíquota do imposto de renda, e aí tem uma questão condicional, né? É uma condição para você usar esse benefício, que é que você não distribua lucro, que você mantenha a capacidade produtiva, que você mantenha o emprego. Então, isso é importante porque este investimento do Estado, né, esta maneira do Estado acudir às empresas, ela também pode ser condicionada para que a gente não tenha desemprego, para que a gente não freie demasiadamente a economia. E esta medida, claro, tem uma condição de que você não demita, e também que você, como o caso da Bélgica, você não traga aí sociedades com participação em paraísos fiscais, né? Então, para você não beneficiar grupos econômicos cuja a transparência não é garantida. Então, tem uma medida interessante nesse momento, certo? Partindo para os impostos indiretos, né, que também a gente vai ter uma contribuição bem interessante nesse painel, específica sobre impostos indiretos, que eu estou ansioso para ouvir. A gente está falando agora de vamos dizer, medidas que podem ajudar o contribuinte a se recuperar com o imposto indireto, mas que tem impactos muito fortes e muito regressivos. A França, por um exemplo, ela fez uma medida de postergar o pagamento do IVA, que boa parte dos países europeus também seguiu, mas além de postergar o pagamento do IVA, a França antecipou a devolução do crédito do IVA. Né? Então, a gente que sofre tanto aqui no Brasil com crédito fiscal, que você nunca recebe ou raramente recebe o crédito fiscal, e a promessa da reforma tributária que você vai passar a receber, não sei como, por varinha de condão, mas na França eles antecipam, então eles dão caixa, e para isso tem a ver a questão do Banco Central Europeu acudir os Estados europeus de liquidez para que os Estados possam fazer isso, ou seja, antecipar a devolução de crédito de IVA, o que faz com que o contribuinte tenha caixa para enfrentar esse período de recessão, certo? O Brasil, assim como os Estados Unidos, também foi mencionado aqui, trabalhou com redução de alíquota de determinados produtos, né? Produtos sanitários, produtos médicos, produtos hospitalares, e alguns casos zerando esses produtos. Aí tem um pouco de discussão hegemônica, porque outros países zeraram completamente alguns produtos, máquinas, equipamentos para hospitais, causando uma distorção muito grande de competição e encarecendo muito determinados produtos e, em contrapartida, barateando muito outros. Né? E nesse sentido, a Alemanha, que reduziu a alíquota do imposto sobre consumo, fez uma reflexão sobre isso no próprio parlamento e lançou uma dúvida que a redução do IVA poderia efetivamente ter uma consequência tão boa para a economia, se haveria uma redução de custos, se haveria uma redução de preço, e lógico, isso ainda não aconteceu. É isso que a gente vai avaliar nos últimos minutos da minha apresentação em relação à distorção sistêmica que medidas como essa causam, porque eu trabalho com a expectativa de alavanca, né? Então aqui é o efeito alavanca da indução. Esta alavanca, como a redução de IVA no consumo, é para baratear preço, mas o preço não é mais barato por decreto, e nem por força, nem por patriotismo, nem por nada dessas questões que são de questão política e não de política fiscal. Então, o que já se observa nos papéis, nos papers, nos artigos que eu tenho lido ultimamente na Alemanha, é que este efeito não aconteceu. Mas há, sim, um incentivo comportamental. Então, a indução dá um incentivo comportamental de impressão para o consumo, e este incentivo comportamental tem efeito inflacionário. Não há dúvida disso. Então, eu acabo consumindo produtos porque eu entendo que esses produtos são mais baratos, muito embora eles não sejam. Mas, de fato, há também um incentivo comportamental de investimento. Então, toda vez que eu induzo o contribuinte com determinada medida, com as medidas que eu mencionei, e que vão ser analisadas pelas minhas sucessoras nesse painel, que eu estou bastante ansioso, como já disse, vai acrescentar uma discussão importante para a questão de sistema. E quando a gente faz esse olhar sistêmico, né, então a gente olha o sistema como um todo, o sistema brasileiro, o sistema europeu, o sistema dos países, vamos dizer, organizados, que estão signatários do CDE ou são colaboradores da OCDE ou pleiteiam uma vaga na OCDE. Esse olhar sistêmico é muito importante porque ele dá uma linha de condução da política fiscal organizada. Como o Aviona propõe em seu paper tão famoso, com o Fito Tanzi, que não é um sistema tributário global, mas ele tem uma ideia de sistema tributário global justamente para a gente trabalhar com o trade-off, ou seja, perda de arrecadação e perda de capacidade contributiva. Eu não sei se é um trade-off ou se é uma coisa que acontece simultaneamente neste momento tão crítico. E quando eu perco a arrecadação e ainda assim eu vou reduzir tributos, eu vou ter uma dupla consequência. Quando eu reduzo tributos na importação, eu crio problemas de preço de transferência no imposto sobre consumo. Quando eu determino barateamento de determinados produtos, eu crio um problema de preço de transferência no imposto de renda. Eu crio determinadas distorções que são difíceis de serem reparadas. E aí, claro, a gente vai estar de novo com o debate entre base territorial e base mundial, em que há um efeito diferente para cada um e que precisa ser bem estudado. Fechando a discussão, então, eu diria, nós estamos diante de uma grande renúncia fiscal, um grande investimento fiscal que afeta a concorrência, tanto interna quanto externa. Então, veja, se nós trabalharmos com a ideia de um sistema global, vai haver uma mitigação da concorrência indevida, uma mitigação dos efeitos nocivos da política fiscal, e que agora eu gostaria de ouvir as minhas colegas que vão trazer muito para esse debate. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor Fernando, pelas riquíssimas considerações sobre os temas de política fiscal. E, sem mais delongas, passo a palavra para a professora Fabiola Nacondia, que vai falar sobre os temas relacionados ao VAT. Bem-vinda, professora. A palavra é sua.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the IVDT for inviting me to participate in this panel. And as I said, as we know, the world at this moment is all struggling with the effect of the COVID-19, with this pandemic virus, and many countries are taking actions to try to fight these pandemics. Governments are also implementing certain measures in order to help business and to help individuals to go ahead with these pandemics. As you're going to see, my presentation will be divided in two different parts. The first one, we are going to talk about the fiscal policy measures, some measures that governments have implemented in the area of VAT, that they will help business and they will help households to overcome this crisis. This will be about the postponement of taxes, the refunds of tax credits, tax rates, and donations. Well, some of these you have already heard from Fernando, but we will go more in depth of the effect of each one of these. Also, I will finalize my presentation, to link it to the presentation after me, about some challenges that business are confronted these days. As I must say, these are only two. They are not all the challenge, because businesses are facing a lot of issues at the moment. But we are going to talk about what happened when business have to sell their stock at loss, and also the changes on consumer behaviors, the changes between physical sales to online sales. And when people is not buying anymore in the store as it used to be, but now they go to a website where they buy their goods. To start, I would like to show a little bit a diagram prepared by the OECD. And here we can see that most countries have introduced or some measures that are aiming to support businesses. From these businesses measures, we see that the majority are for supporting the cash flows and reducing the compliance burdens of these businesses, as at the same time to support healthcare sectors and also support consumption. When we look at the table, we can see that around 70% of the countries that there are at the OECD G20, they have implemented some kind of deferment of the payment of tax, some postponements of tax payments. Some countries have introduced measures that they are automatic, and some countries, they have conditionals or under request. But we will see that now when we explain these measures. We also see that a lot of countries have made release or suspension of penalties and interest, and less, but almost 50% of the countries have also implemented some reduced rate or certain exemptions for certain goods and services, and in general also related to the sector more affected by the COVID-19. Another of the topics that Fernando just talked about, it was the enhancements of credit, like the refund procedures, accelerating tax refunds to businesses. And that's also, we have seen that is like quite common. And later on, as we see, the last 4 measures are measures more related to administrative issues, and that they are helping business to, like at the moment that they have a crisis and they have like maybe shortage of staff because of sickness or anything, that they can like help them with the administration of the tax. My presentation will be about the 4 first measures and the measures that have been implemented in the majority of the countries. The first one that we are going to talk is the component of tax. Why this measure? Why this measure was introduced? This can help business like a financial themselves, because as we said, VAT measures are in the broad context have some unique qualities in the term of speed and cost to administrate. As we know, the VAT, it's a tax that in general is charged and remitted in a very short period of time, in a month's time or in a very short period, in a couple of weeks, the business have to remit this tax to the tax authorities. And that's why if we introduce a measure that postpone this tax, we will have an immediate effect and an immediate benefits for business. And also for the tax administration, compare if they do a measure in other taxes, because they will take longer to impact the business. And related to that is the cash flow, because this is a measure to support business and to support the cash flows of them. As we know, in this crisis, there are many businesses that they have fixed costs that they have to continue paying. As Diana was mentioning, the costs of employees that they are not even going to business, all kind of costs, rents and everything, even though the business was not performing their activities, these costs are there. And that's why this measure is good, at least in the short term, because in the long term, the postponement of tax doesn't have any effect. You will have to pay your taxes whenever it happens, but at least in the short term, it gives cash flow to business to continue surviving, as I put it there, also to give liquidity, to make the businesses that they continue their business as a going concerns. And that is a measure that is also in the implementation area for tax administration and business is very easy, because it's only they don't need to change the VAT system, they don't need to make a reform, they don't need to do much more than inform the taxpayers that they are postponing certain taxes, and that it have, at least in the short term, a good effect. And when we go, we can see some measures. I try to put some example of countries, what they are doing, because that's what I say. Some countries are deferring the payment of taxes. Other countries, they are waiving the interest and penalties. They are proposing payment plans. And some countries are making really broad postponement of taxes. For example, everybody can postpone for 3 months the payment of VAT. Other countries are more targeted, maybe for SMEs, or targeted to certain sectors that they are affected for the pandemic. And also it's the same. Some are unconditional. Everybody, no condition to postpone the payment of taxes. Other are putting conditions. You have to fulfill these conditions, and you have to prove maybe that your business is linked to the pandemic. For example, restaurants, if they are closed or things like that, they are easy to realize it, that they are there. Examples, I put 300 random examples because there were a lot. For example, Curacao, even a small island, they put the deferment of the payment of the tax debts, and also they reduce the interest on tax debts from 6% that is a standard to 0%, and there are not fines if someone is paying late. More here in Europe, Cyprus is having also an arrangement for the VAT liability to be paid gradually until November 2020. And the Netherlands is making on requests, that's what I say. This is more, they can request to cess the collection of outstanding tax debt for a certain period, And also they make an emergency payment deferral regime that also under certain conditions, like someone can apply for this postponement of the taxes. As you see, all similar but different. And now related to that, they are like the second measure that I would like to talk is the refund of tax credits. And like Fernando already told that France, it was introduced one of these measures. And what is this? Many businesses, I would say, is the same. They are at risk of going into insolvencies. These measures can support the cash flow position of business. It's another measure also, like it's an indirect financial help from the governments. Like in this way, they can support employment, and indirectly, they can maybe support also the cross-border trade through quicker export refunds. Because if you like have an export refund, you export and you do not get your maybe your VAT like back soon, well, you can get into problems, but well, giving accelerated refund, quickly refund of the VAT related to that export, it can even like help the cross-border trade, which is important also to business to continue their operation, because they need to continue also exporting, even the country having border, let's say, closed or having issues with their borders. And when we go to like simple or not, like this is also a measure could be relatively simple to introduce because all countries have like measures for refunding VAT, but the only thing they have to be very careful because they have to put the appropriate risk management measures. As we know, there is a lot of on cross-border transaction, and well, here even in the European Union, better not to talk about the VAT gap, but they have to minimize the risk of fraud, because in the area of like refunds, we can accelerate it, but well, it's always a risky area. That's what I say. Refund quicker, but take enough measures if you are a government introducing these measures. And what are the main measures that governments are introducing? Well, as I said, accelerated payment of VAT, automatic refunds without investigation, because as you know, normally there are some audits before, but well, countries are providing like first the refunds and later maybe under the risk management controls, they can do the audits. Sometimes like making shorter periods like for tax payers which have credits, because in that way, like instead of waiting for a quarter, maybe on a monthly basis, they can present their returns and get their credits. Sometimes offer them to offset the tax credit with other credits and with other taxes. And in that way, like get also, let's say, a cash flow advantage. And even like some countries that normally when you have an excess VAT, they tell you carry forward, and use it later. For a period of time, switch from the carry forward to refunds. And like in that way, again, like make liquidity for the business. Examples of countries, well, Belgium accelerate the VAT refund under certain conditions. Well, France, it was already mentioned, it's not in my list, but it was already mentioned it before. Ireland also give priority to VAT refunds. Latvia say that they will do all refunds within 30 days and also create a special regime for like a taxpayer would have like credits. Luxembourg decide to make automatic reimbursement of credit when they are below 10,000 euros. They say everything that is less than 10,000 euros we give quickly. That's another way that countries did it, introducing a threshold. Romania accelerate the refund, and what they explain is that there will be subsequent IDs depending on the risk analysis. As you see, all countries are similar, but all there are a little bit difference, and it's also depending on the availabilities and of the country to provide one or the other. Going like this, we go to the tax rates that it was already mentioned. Like there is a lot of countries that they introduce rate reductions, and this turn normally to work more on consumer demand crisis. And this, as we know, is not like the challenge of this crisis. This crisis is another challenge. These measures aim at supporting the functioning and funding of the healthcare sector, and at the same time to stimulate consumptions. But however, many tax authorities have already questioned it, that it was said before, the effectiveness of this measure. And it also, in reality, the price reduction that they generate, because as we are going to see on my overview, the majority of countries, what they did is they reduced the rate on certain items. And like the issue is this price reduction really was passed through to the consumer, and really the prices of that kind of goods were lower. That is very difficult to say. Like there is a lot of experience and a lot of I think studies about that. A lot of time price reductions on VAT rates do not create the price reduction that the government consider. Because as long as the clients continue paying the same price, the price reduction is more or less disappearing. But also the majority of these reductions at the moment are temporary. What is going to happen when these reductions are reversed? When the government tries to tax again with the standard rate these goods? As we know, there is always good when something is reduced, it's sold for a lower price, but well, what about when it's increase it? That will be I'm sure there will be political difficulties. And also this reduction have a lot of impact on businesses, because business have to change all their systems when they sell goods and services. And they have to be very clear list of what is reduced and what not. Because there is a lot of risk that interpretation. People consider that something is reduced when it's not, and later there is a lot of complexity in the system. And as I say, it's very difficult for the taxpayers for fulfilling this. And that's why, is this a good measure or not? It's difficult to say. I think it's, if we try to incentivize consumption and everything could be, but well, it's very difficult to get if the result is the desired one. And as I said, the majority of the supplies that they were reduced rated, the rate was reduced, is all related to COVID-19 supplies, sanitary products, healthcare, everything related to services related to hospital, to institutions that they provide healthcare, and some countries also they put, because as we all know, there is a lot of borders, where they were closed and everything, and people also is afraid to travel, and that's why some countries try to put reduced rate in the tourism and the travel services, because in that way they want to make people come to their countries. I make a list, which for sure is not complete, but is quite extended, of countries that they introduce reduced rate in this type of services. And but I want to show, that's why I say the majority of the countries reduce the rate, even for example, countries like Kenya reduce also the standard rate. And for my attention, when I was doing my research, I found that 2 countries, instead of reducing, increase the rate. That is strange. For example, Indonesia, what they did is they introduced a 10% rate, standard rate in digital products, because they were not taxing them. And when you buy from abroad, now they tax it. And I think that is fair, because it's more for competition, fair competition between the business and abroad and in the country. And Saudi Arabia justified that because of COVID-19, they need more money, and they changed the standard rate from 5% to 15% from 1st of July 2020. And surprisingly, that I don't have more comment on that, because it's yeah, the government needs more money, but also the economy needs more money. But okay, that's to call the attention. Related to tax rate, we go to donations. Well, there is going to be quickly on this. Donations in general, there are disincentive, because either businesses do not have to, they have restricted the input tax deduction, or they have to consider in supplies of goods. And that's why they have to make an account for VAT on that transactions. But that's why several countries, what they did is say, well, we are going to incentive donations, we are going to zero rate it, or exempt them. And this way, there are no costs on these goods and services, the price is low. Well, they could try business behavior to go to this kind of goods and and services that they were zero rated, and to donate more for businesses. And this is also difficult sometimes for businesses, because, well, they have to adapt their systems, and But like it's quite easy, like you change the legislation and you have suddenly like that donations are zero rated and exempting, and businesses like they are more in favor to do this. This zero rate is, as I say, is again related to healthcare institutions in general. And well, when you zero rate something, you know that you have the credit, you are allowed to deduct the input VAT in the cost. The only thing, you don't have to pay any output tax. Also, like I put 4 countries that donations of computers in Belgium are exempted. In Greece, all supplies of mobile and immobile property to charities related to COVID. Poland, like certain medical equipment are also zero rated. Montenegro, the importation and the supply of products and services as donations. And this was also explained by Fernando, that a lot of countries on import of certain like goods for COVID, they have created a exemption or a zero rate to like promote these kind of donations. Going from there and going to the other 2 challenges, yes.
Só um instante, professora, eu lhe daria mais 1 minuto para a conclusão.
Yeah.
Nosso tempo está...
Perfect. Yeah, I'm trying to jump in now. Yeah, well, and like 2 challenges, as I say, for business, like, well, like as we say, business have a lot of challenges. These are more to link into transfer pricing. That is the presentation that Agatha will do after me. When you sell something like, you know, like on a lower price than the normal price, you can have like that you have a consideration, or you supply something free of charge. If you supply something free of charge as regard VAT, you always have to consider a deemed supply, and you will always have to pay from VAT. Considerations in general, as a business, you can put a higher price, a lower price, but it will be irrelevant. But however, when you have the sale and you are at like selling for a lower price, when you are related parties, they are in general, if one of the 2 parties does not have the full right to deduct, or they have a limited right to deduct, you will have to look in the majority of countries in the world at the open market value. And this can be a challenge at this time. And the last one is also like business are confronted with like changes on behavior, as we say. People is not like at the moment of lockdown or restrictions or anything like to go out. They are not buying anymore like on a store, but maybe are buying online. The problem is in one hand is the supply of goods can convert in a supply of services, book to an e-book, and there the place of supply, the chargeable event, the tax rate and exemptions can be different and can have different VAT treatment. The second one, like if you change the model, you know, you are go to a store in one country and suddenly you are buying in an online web shop in another country, you can have also different rates because, for example, in the European Union, you buy something in a store, you pay VAT, something comes from a web shop in the US, a good lower than 22 euros, no VAT in the European Union. Not going to talk, but even if you do it in an interface in a platform, VAT rules will be different. With this, I would like to thank you. And for sure, the last 2 topics we will be talking like Agatha from the side of transfer pricing. Sorry for my delay. Too much to say.
Sem problemas, professora. A gente tem que ser rígido com o tempo, mas tivemos valiosas considerações, complementando as considerações dos demais panelistas. Foi muito boa a apresentação, agradecemos. Com isso, passo a palavra para a professora Agatha Uceda, que vai tecer algumas considerações sobre preços de transferência no impacto da Covid. Por favor, professora, 15 minutos. Bem-vinda novamente.
Thank you everybody, and thank you for the time to discuss briefly some of the transfer pricing dilemmas that multinationals are facing in the face of this pandemic. I'm going to try to summarize the presentation in 3 main areas. One, the most important one, the most immediate one is the one that is related to benchmarking and how to address the sudden drop in profitability in the multinational, right? Either from the manufacturing, from the distributor, or from all the players in the supply chain. The other one is specific to one-time restructurings. What happens if you have to shut down the manufacturing plant? This is not, many companies are not doing that yet, but they're planning things like that for next year, for example. What do you do with those restructuring costs? And then I will end up with a couple of case studies. So if you look at what are the main transfer pricing challenges that multinationals are facing in the face of the pandemic, the immediate question that came, of course, in March of this year was about reviewing the target margins that the companies are using within the group. If you see the transfer pricing policy of a normal multinational, that you will have certain target operating margins, for example, for the region Europe or for the region APAC, Americas. As I was saying, the immediate question of the multinationals is, can we reduce the margins, right? If our distributors, a fashion company was earning before a 5% operating margin last year, can we drop them to 3%, 2%, 1%, or even zero? Can we leave the company at a loss? Another question that the companies had very soon in the pandemic in March already is usually these transfer pricing adjustments within the group are done quarterly, right? So an important question is, do we still do the adjustment in March for the first 3 months, knowing that the results are going to be completely different in June? Or do we do the adjustments much later in the year, right? Some companies have set up crisis teams to deal with the crisis. Can we recharge special management fees for the services that the headquarters are providing to the subsidiaries? On the other side, one-time transactions are important as well, right? If the company is deciding to shut down a manufacturing plant or or closing part of the manufacturing plant as a result of being not used for a number of months, what to do with those costs? Do they stay always with the manufacturing company, or can they be shifted to the principal, or can the loss be shared with the distributors? Any penalties, for example, from canceling rental agreements, long-term rental agreements with tenants, can we deduct that locally, or do we have to send that to the principal, to the company that took the decision? At the beginning, also in March, there were quite some questions about whether it was possible or easy or difficult to change the intercompany agreements. Sometimes the intercompany agreements are not drafted very carefully, and they don't have a clause that allows for a force majeure event, something like a natural disaster or a pandemic or something like that, that would allow contractually, legally, to change the remuneration between the two parties. I think that's a relatively simple question, because many companies were certainly changing terms and conditions of dealings with third-party suppliers. So that would itself be a reason to be able to change the intercompany agreement, even if there was no clause in the agreement that allowed to do that. And I think a question related to that is whether you could invoke that force majeure clause in March, when the pandemic was basically unexpected, at least in Europe, and whether you could still invoke that clause now in October, when we are going through a second wave and the business has had time to prepare for the changes coming up. And of course, the question about if you have agreements with the tax authorities, things like APAs or rulings that have certain critical assumptions, do you need to change those as well? In terms of the benchmarking, because it's the most immediate question for taxpayers, the things that we have been exploring is that the first one is to try to update the searches that were done for fiscal year 2019. But this is almost impossible, because the data in Americas is available only 12 months after the close of the financial year. And in Europe, is sometimes available only 2 years after the close of the financial year. So if I would be looking at data today or in March of comparable companies, I only have data up to 2018 at best. So I'm not catching any COVID impact. Another possibility, of course, is to use the most recent data, the 2018 data, and then try to do some adjustments manually of the results of the comparable companies, right? That can be very simple adjustments, like, for example, including loss-making companies in the set, or they can be more complicated adjustments, like looking at GDP forecasts for the region or for the country and trying to extrapolate that in the results of the companies. But that's very arbitrary, right? Because any GDP forecast that we had in March were not good. Even the GDP forecasts that we have right now are changing basically by the week. So you would come to a number that would not be very reliable. So what we have been doing really in practice is looking at the prior crisis, right? And even though Diane mentioned that the crisis is not comparable from a macroeconomics point of view, at least we have an indicator of how much profitability dropped from, let's say, 2006, 2007 to the years of the financial crisis, 2008, 9, 10, depending if you look at Europe or Americas, right? And if you actually look at the comparable data, we have been looking at some sectors over a number of years, right? You can see that if you look at the returns of distributors over 10, 15 years, and you look at, for example, here in the screen, the construction sector, the 2008-9 crisis hit it very badly, real estate, construction, automotive players, that you can certainly see a drop in profitability. So we can use that decline in profitability to try to forecast that to the minimum, at least the results of the distributor of automotive companies right now, for example, will drop like that, right? It probably will drop more, but at least we have an indication of how it could drop. It's just that, as you can see in the screen, it doesn't show so clearly for all types of distributors. So if you look above the construction to the industrial operating margins over the years 2006, 2013, or even up to today, because we have that data, we can go back up to 15, 20 years, you see the returns quite stable, right? So you cannot say very much for a distributor of industrial equipment, whereas I can say something for a distributor of construction equipment. And if I look at manufacturers instead of a distributor, you can see the drop even much bigger in 2008 and 9. So this is quite common, right? That a distributor is able to adjust their operating expenses much quicker than a manufacturer. So when you look at the returns of distribution over long term, they are more stable than the returns of manufacturing companies. So you see here, for example, the big drop in profitability of manufacturers of automotive and auto parts in the first picture. Then you see the drop also in 2009 and 10 of automotive manufacturing. You see a big drop also in industrial products. And we just put on the right-hand side below the example of bakery, right? To show that, well, it's not that all the manufacturing business went down at the same time. Diane was saying it impacted different sectors in different ways. Well, apparently people eat a lot of bread during a crisis, and bakeries did much better in 2009. And I'm sure they did this year as well in Europe, I can tell you. So just briefly summarizing, there are some advantages of using the data of 2008-9, right? Is that relatively easy to get that data. It's easy to calculate and explain to the tax authorities if you would want to use that data of 2008-9. If you would want to do a regression analysis based on GDP data of today, it becomes a very complicated and complex analysis, and I think not very reliable either, because there are too many uncertainties in those forecasts, right? The disadvantage is what Diane already anticipated, and is that, well, the crisis of 2008-9 is not the same than this crisis. So when we look in 2021 to 2020, we may find that, well, that comparison was not good enough, right? So that's something we have to keep in mind. If I can say something briefly about now my screen is frozen, about the intercompany loans, right? That was mostly about changing the prices and the supply of goods, manufacturing of goods, or distribution of goods and services. The crisis has also an impact on the intercompany financing of companies, right? It has an impact from the lender's perspective. How much are they willing to lend to their subsidiary if the subsidiary is basically not going to be able to repay the loan? It has an impact on the terms of the intercompany debt, right? If the group are renegotiating debt with third parties, then shouldn't they renegotiate also the debt intergroup, right? For example, being able to pay the debt later or to postpone the payment of interest. The problem that we have with the benchmarking of intercompany debt is that it's basically changing by the month, right? So when we look at this question, when we were looking at this question in March of this year, we thought, well, the spreads, the risk in the system is increasing, the spreads are going to increase, so we have to be careful with the interest rates that we're using in the intercompany loans. But of course, then all these governments came with the support that Diane has explained and Fernando as well, and suddenly the spreads drop actually as compared to the prior year. So whereas we thought that the risk is increasing, thus we have to increase the interest rates, when you actually look at the data in March and April, it was saying completely the opposite, right? Not only that, there was very little issuance of debt. So there were not many observations from March to June on the debt markets, especially for credit ratings below investment grade. So we have now the question, if you want to issue debt intergroup for a longer time period, that you basically cannot justify because you don't find the information to be able to justify. And usually when we are doing this analysis, we look at bonds, right, or debt issue by banks. We don't consider the government grants as a third-party comparable, right, in that case. And I think also to tie back to the comment of Diane before, if you look at the impact that the crisis has had across sectors, at least in Europe, this is the data we have from Standard & Poor's, it's very different per sector, right? So we see, of course, all the players on retail, leisure that you have on the right-hand side, entertainment, fashion, high fashion, media and entertainment on the site, not online, with a very high risk of default in many cases, right? EBITDA declines of up to 60%, 40%, which would have immediately an impact on the ability to borrow of those companies, right? From third parties, from banks. But on the other extreme, we have, of course, companies that have been having to dispose of inventory, right? Like Fabiola was saying, what do you do if you consider selling a product at a loss, right? Well, it's not a hypothetical situation. It is happening, right? That companies are basically having to dispose the full inventory or the full season of the spring, right? Or in a fashion industry, for example, or in some of the retailers. But if you look at other players, right? Anything, healthcare, pharmaceutical companies, online retail, telecom, software, online entertainment, those companies have actually done much better than they were in the prior year, right? So when you are doing this analysis, either for the normal returns of the distributors or manufacturers or for the pricing if the intercompany loan, you need to be very focused on which sector are you looking at, right? Yeah. Then there is the question that's more for the ongoing transfer pricing transactions. Then you have the question of specific restructurings that will start to happen, I think, at the end of this financial year and next year, right? Companies that had the manufacturing plant closed for too long and need to shut it down, or they have two manufacturing plants, one's in the Netherlands and one in the Czech Republic, and they need to decide which one to close. If you look at that question, this is a very well-known question in the OECD guidelines, is described in Chapter 9, business restructuring, right? Generally, the reply that the OECD guidelines give is that if the company was a routine entity, so if it was, for example, a contract manufacturing in the Czech Republic, and you decide to close that one and move the manufacturing activities to Germany or to Asia, that the cost of that restructuring would be paid by the principal to the contract manufacturing arrangement. So it could be the final shareholder, but it could be just the manufacturing principal, right? It could be related to a full manufacturing shutdown, but it could also be redundancy costs that you decide that you have to in your shop, like Fabiola was saying, sales are moving online, that in your shop you have to reduce the sales personnel from 100 to 50 and you have these redundancy costs, right? Do you deduct that cost locally in the distributor, or does the manufacturer or some other company in the group need to pay for that? Again, basic reply of the OECD guidelines in that case is that, well, the one taking the decision and the one benefiting from the restructuring is the one that has to pay, which is not necessarily the local company. If you move manufacturing from Germany to the Czech Republic manufacturing capacity increases, they benefit from that, so they would be able or willing to pay for that. But I think the main observation here is that the OECD guidelines also say that you have to look at the options realistically available to the party that is being restructured, right? And what we're finding if we do this analysis today is that in many cases, there is no option other than shutting down that plant or reducing the workforce in that distributor. So I think there is a very good case for the taxpayer to try to argue that at least part of the restructuring cost of this crisis could be deducted locally, even though the company may have been a routine distributor, right? That's, I think, an important point. And just referring again to the fact that this crisis is unique and has hit some players like retailers, leisure, hotels, all at the same time and all in the same way. So there is no alternative than just basically stopping with the business in some cases. I have a couple of examples of that, right? One relates to yeah. Yes, I'm done.
Mas, minutinho
yes.
E meio.
It's just two examples repeating basically what I just said, that in this case, there was a principal company with a contract manufacturing using a 4 or 5% and a distributor earning a 3.5. When the company reduced the margins to 2% for manufacturing and below 1% for the distributor, the tax authorities argued that this reduction in margins was not arm's length. But we were able to show by showing that they had no alternative other than restructuring to reduce the margin, right? And the same for the shutting down of a plant in France in a US, for a US multinational. The French tax authorities were arguing that you could not deduct the restructuring costs, but after we showed the case that basically there was no alternative other than restructuring, the company was able to deduct part of the restructuring costs. So just illustrating the main points I did before in practice, recent cases. Thank you.
Obrigado, professora Ágata. Muito interessantes as considerações. Agora, passo a palavra para o professor Ramon Tomazella Santos, para um apanhado geral, nosso moderador. A palavra é sua, Ramon, por favor.
Obrigado, Bruno. Dado o avançar da hora, eu vou tentar fazer uma breve contextualização, né, do que foi dito no nosso painel sobre uma perspectiva internacional e tentar correlacionar com o direito brasileiro, né? E eu acho que o primeiro ponto é quando a gente pensa numa perspectiva de política fiscal e tenta trazer isso para uma análise macroeconômica, né? A gente tem que pensar em diferentes momentos, né, da tributação. O primeiro é o enfrentamento imediato da crise, o segundo é a recuperação econômica e o terceiro é a restauração dos cofres públicos, né, de todo esse investimento que foi feito pelo Estado para a recuperação da economia. E como a professora Daiane mencionou na apresentação dela, é um equilíbrio que é difícil, né, de ser alcançado na prática. E com isso, né, passando pela apresentação do professor Fernando, ele mencionou primeiro a questão da postergação do pagamento, né, e que é um exemplo claro de uma medida que ela funciona bem no enfrentamento da crise e também não tem um impacto grande nos cofres públicos, mas, ao mesmo tempo, quando a gente está falando da recuperação do Estado na recessão econômica, ela não funciona tão bem porque as empresas terão que pagar tanto os tributos ordinariamente devidos quanto aqueles que foram postergados, né? Então, quando você está falando da recuperação da economia, essa medida pode não funcionar tão bem. O professor Fernando também mencionou a questão da compensação de prejuízos fiscais, né? Os Estados Unidos é um bom exemplo de um país que relaxou as suas travas na compensação de prejuízos, inclusive permitindo a compensação retroativa de prejuízos gerados pós-reforma tributária de 2017 com prejuízos gerados anteriormente. Então, você tem uma compensação de prejuízos gerados a uma alíquota de 21% contra lucros que seriam tributados a uma alíquota de 35%. Então, é um sistema bem flexível, mas, sob o ponto de vista do direito brasileiro, eu teria dúvidas sobre o direcionamento desse tipo de incentivo fiscal, primeiro porque as empresas que estão sujeitas ao lucro real representam, né, em torno de 5 a 10% das empresas brasileiras, e ainda que a gente considere que essas empresas são aquelas relevantes economicamente, é um tipo de incentivo fiscal que é de difícil direcionamento, porque a gente pode ter uma situação em que os prejuízos que estão sendo compensados são de anos anteriores, não são aqueles prejuízos gerados na pandemia, e que na prática, então, mesmo os vencedores, aquelas empresas que estão tendo super profits, né, as empresas digitais ou do setor de alimentos que estão tendo um lucro extraordinário na pandemia, elas ainda poderiam aproveitar essa regra. Então, é uma medida que não é tão bem direcionada. Passando para a apresentação da professora Fabiola, ela mencionou bastante a questão dos incentivos dos tributos indiretos, né, do VAT, e que é uma política fiscal que o Brasil adota, né? A gente tem todos aqueles exemplos de redução do IPI para a linha branca e também no setor automotivo, né? E é uma forma de estimular o consumo e, com o consumo, ocupar aquela capacidade produtiva da economia brasileira. Então, é uma política fiscal que, em geral, funciona bem naquela fase 2, né, da recuperação econômica pós-pandemia, mas que no sistema brasileiro a gente tem uma certa dificuldade de fazer uma política fiscal coerente com esses tributos sobre o consumo, pelo fato de que a gente tem o consumo sendo tributado por entes federativos distintos, né? A gente tem o IPI, o ICMS e o ISS. E acrescentando um pouco para a discussão, o que eu acho que eu sinto falta um pouco sobre a perspectiva do direito brasileiro seriam medidas de desoneração da folha de pagamento, não uma simples substituição da folha por tributação de receita, mas, na verdade, eventualmente, reduções, por exemplo, de base de cálculo baseadas na manutenção de emprego por cada tipo de empresa ou por setor, e também a questão da tributação das vendas inadimplidas, né? Isso é um problema que a gente consegue resolver no âmbito do imposto de renda com as perdas no recebimento de crédito, mas no âmbito do PIS/COFINS a gente não tem previsão para a exclusão das receitas inadimplidas e também no âmbito da tributação indireta. E é um ponto que, quando a gente está falando de um cenário de crise, é complicado para as empresas porque você não tem a mercadoria que foi vendida, não tem a receita, né, não tem o preço de venda e ainda tem que pagar tributo para o Estado. Então, quando a gente está falando de um cenário de crise, talvez essa fosse uma medida de política legislativa que seria interessante para o Brasil. Sob o ponto de vista internacional, né, acho que a professora Agatha abordou bem as questões de preço de transferência e sob o enfoque do direito brasileiro, a gente já começa que tem uma dificuldade logo de partida, porque as regras de preço de transferência elas sempre tentam olhar qual seria o comportamento de partes independentes e condições normais de mercado. E quando a gente está falando de uma crise, de uma pandemia, a gente não tem condições normais de mercados e isso cria toda essa dificuldade de benchmark, que foi mencionada pela professora Agatha, e também uma própria dificuldade de como seria o comportamento das empresas quando a gente faz vendas com prejuízos ou quando tem que fazer uma alocação internacional de prejuízo. E as próprias diretrizes da OCDE de preços de transferência, elas não trazem uma orientação segura em relação a esse ponto, né? A OCDE trata de crises econômicas no capítulo da reestruturação de negócios e no capítulo das operações financeiras intragrupos, mas de uma forma, né, bastante superficial. E o que traz um problema sobre essa perspectiva internacional. E quando a gente tenta trazer essa realidade para o direito brasileiro, a questão fica um pouco mais complicada, porque o Brasil, nas suas regras de preço de transferências, ele traz limitações à livre comparabilidade entre transações e margens predeterminadas de lucro. E isso, quando eu tenho essas situações que foram tratadas nas apresentações de uma venda com prejuízo, onde um distribuidor de risco limitado que teve prejuízo em determinado ano, fica muito difícil conciliar isso com as regras brasileiras, porque eu não posso, né, fazer uma venda, por exemplo, com custo menos 15. Né? A Instrução Normativa 1312, ela tem uma regra até para operações atípicas, mas que ela basicamente exclui essas operações atípicas do cálculo do preço parâmetro e não do controle de preço de transferência. Então, eu fico numa situação em que as empresas brasileiras continuam tendo que aplicar as regras de preço de transferência nessas situações anormais de crise econômica. E nessa situação específica, né, que foi mencionada pela professora Agatha, de um distribuidor de risco limitado no exterior, o problema que tem surgido na prática é que as empresas brasileiras, elas tentam, então, encontrar mecanismos para fazer uma alocação dessa perda para a pessoa jurídica que está no Brasil, fora das regras de preço de transferência. Então, ou essa empresa brasileira faz um pagamento como uma espécie de compensação para o distribuidor de risco limitado no exterior, e daí nós vamos ter uma discussão se essa despesa seria dedutível do lucro real e da base de cálculo da CSL no direito brasileiro, ou ela tenta fazer vendas futuras com preço inferior ao padrão de mercado para que nas revendas efetuadas por esse distribuidor de risco limitado, essa margem de lucro seja eventualmente compensado. E daí a gente acaba tendo um problema sobre a perspectiva do direito brasileiro, que são as margens predeterminadas de lucro. Eu não consigo fazer essa venda sem ter um ajuste de preço de transferência, né, porque eu tenho margens predeterminadas, uma margem de divergência de 5% em geral, e quando eu estou falando de exportação de commodities, uma margem de 3%, que não é suficiente para remunerar as atividades que são feitas por esse distribuidor de risco limitado no exterior. E tudo isso confirma, de certa forma, que o Brasil, quando adota regras de preço de transferência que se distanciam da prática internacional, né, eu não sou um defensor das regras de preço de transferências da OCDE, mas quando a gente adota uma postura que está completamente fora do que é seguido no padrão internacional, a gente acaba trazendo consequências para as empresas brasileiras, porque o Brasil acaba se colocando, ou ele aparece como um exportador de commodities ou de produtos básicos, ou como mercado consumidor, e ele acaba ficando fora das cadeias internacionais de geração de valor. Então, isso acaba sendo uma consequência dessas regras rígidas de preços de transferência que a gente tem. Eu acho que é isso, né, em razão do tempo aqui, acho que não cabe avançar muito nos meus comentários. Eu devolvo a palavra para o Bruno para suas considerações finais.
Muito obrigado, professor Ramon, pelas considerações, o apanhado geral, o relacionamento com a legislação brasileira. E com isso, então, damos aqui por encerrado o nosso painel. Agradeço a participação dos painelistas, peço perdão pela indiscrição na interrupção das apresentações. Era o meu papel aqui nesta manhã, mas eu acredito que, apesar disso, conseguimos cumprir o nosso objetivo, abordamos todos os pontos de maneira suficiente e profunda, e de forma que atingimos o nosso objetivo, e agradecemos a todos pela atenção e convidamos a todos para o próximo painel, que vai tratar de planejamento tributário internacional. Muito obrigado e fiquem bem.